He's John Timpane.
And he's Don Rooney.
And this is
The Musical Innertube.
Now, you may ask, why is this podcast called The Musical Innertube?
And we may reply, because that's its name, of course.
Now, how did this podcast get that name?
Back in college, we hosted a radio show. Once, we tried to introduce a soothing musical interlude.
Instead, we messed up and wound up introducing a soothing musical innertube, and the name stuck.
So here we are, hundreds of years later, still talking
to interesting people about their interesting lives.
Difference makers who really make a difference. On this episode, we are very proud and excited to have as our guest Jennifer Lin, filmmaker, writer, and journalist. Jennifer worked for more than 30 years for the Philadelphia Inquirer, reporting from New York, Washington, D.C., Taiwan, Beijing, places like that there. And among her books is Shanghai Faithful, about her Chinese family's spiritual and international journey from China to the United States and from Asian traditions to Christianity. As a filmmaker, she produced and created Beethoven in Beijing, a documentary about the famous 1973 visit of the Philadelphia Orchestra to China, which premiered on PBS in 2021. Welcome, my dear erstwhile colleague, Jennifer Lin.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you for that intro. It's nice to be here.
So, Jennifer, you've just returned from China just now, where you had quite the experience with Beethoven in Beijing. Can you catch us up on that story?
Yeah, well, I am literally just back from China and suffering from jet lag, but I was in 5 cities in China and screening Beethoven in Beijing. So it was quite an experience because it was the first time I was able to share the film with Chinese audiences. I was in Hong Kong, Guangzhou, Shanghai, Beijing, and it was thrilling.
And it came about, you didn't go out there intending to do that, or did you?
Well, I got an invitation from the University of Hong Kong to come out to Hong Kong to give a talk about my family memoir, Shanghai Faithful. And the university also set up a screening for Beethoven in Beijing. And so since I was in that part of the world and hadn't been there for 4 years, I thought, well, I'll try to have some other screenings. I reached out to the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, and they helped to arrange screenings at their consulates, as well as the embassy in Beijing. So that's how it came about. It was really a trip to talk about Shanghai Faithful, but then I tacked on these other screenings.
What was the reaction of your Chinese? This was the first time you had a chance to sort of do a little tour with the film in China.
It was really interesting, both for the book Shanghai Faithful and for Beethoven in Beijing, to be able to share it with Chinese audiences. So with Shanghai Faithful, for instance, with American audiences, a lot of times I have to do a lot of explaining. Shanghai Faithful is about 5 generations of the Lin family. And through this family saga, you really learn about Christianity and modern Chinese history. So, again, with American audiences, there's a lot of explaining of history and important moments in Chinese history, like the Cultural Revolution, etc. But in Hong Kong, I didn't have to do any explaining. These people, for them, it was a shared experience, what I was talking about with my family.
Sure.
So that was really an intense experience. And the same with Beethoven in Beijing. The movie looks at the Philadelphia Orchestra's historic trip to China in 1973, but it really goes to the present. We start in 1973, but the film ends in the present. And through the Philadelphia Orchestra's experience in China, you really witness the revival of Western classical music in China. So again, it was a similar sort of thing. It's interesting, the different audiences that I had in China and kind of the different reactions. So in Guangzhou, it was very young, the audience, and people were more interested, I think, in the filmmaking process. In Shanghai is a real hub of music history. It has one of the oldest and best conservatories, one of the oldest and best symphonies. And there in the audience, there were a couple of, older musicians who remember when the Philadelphia Orchestra went to China in 1973. Then in Beijing, people were really interested in some of my archival assets that I have in the film. one of my absolute favorite discoveries, John, was a digital recording of President Nixon picking up the phone in the Oval Office and inviting Eugene Ormandy to go to China. Now, Americans remember that Nixon had a bad habit of recording those Oval Office conversations, and those are really now in the public domain.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah,
Oh.
so for documentary filmmakers, it's gold. And so I actually found that recording at the Nixon Library. And so in Beijing, some of the audience people were asking me, how did you get a copy of Nixon, on the phone? It was kind of mind blowing to them, the idea that you could have a recording of your president. And so that was interesting. And there was also a lot of archival material from the Cultural Revolution.
Yeah.
In the film, which is not allowed to be shown on Chinese TV. So, in this private screening that we had, some people were kind of surprised to see that imagery.
And, somebody in that film, in Beethoven in Beijing, makes the claim that right after the orchestra came the first time in 1973, there was an explosion of enthusiasm for Beethoven and Western music.
Yeah.
And an explosion of people getting their kids music lessons, which to some extent is responsible for what often seems to be the dominance of soloists who are of Chinese origin, people coming to the Curtis Institute in Philly or Juilliard in New York. So that explosion of enthusiasm for Western music was really a signal that the Cultural Revolution, which had been so bloody and so destructive, was pretty much over. I'd love to hear you think aloud about that for a moment.
Yeah. So, there was a classical music tradition in China. Dating back 150 years to when there was an influx of foreigners into the country. And so the Shanghai Symphony Orchestra is actually older than the Philadelphia Orchestra, dates back to the late 1800s. So there was this tradition. It was performed. Even after 1949, you could still perform Beethoven. But what happened is 1966 was the start of the Cultural Revolution. And this is the thing that's hard to explain to an American audience. This was a time of political turmoil, and you were not allowed to perform Western classical music. It was forbidden. And so when the Philadelphia Orchestra came to town, the Cultural Revolution was still going on. It had calmed down quite a bit, but still, these musicians were not allowed to perform anything from the Western canon. So, when the Philadelphia Orchestra arrived, it was just, a moment when when people could enjoy the music again. I have a cousin who is a pianist, and she was at the Shanghai Conservatory of Music when the Cultural Revolution started, and she really suffered. Her training kind of ended. Red Guards took away her piano. They destroyed her sheet music. But she got a ticket to go hear the Philadelphia Orchestra when they were in Shanghai. And she told me later that it was just like being in a desert and getting a drink of water. It was just so rewarding to be able to hear the music again. So all of this ended in 1976 when Mao died. That's when the Cultural Revolution ended. And, there's a line in our film where, someone mentions how in 1977, a Chinese orchestra performed Beethoven's Fifth live on national radio. And that's when musicians knew that the Cultural Revolution was really over.
Wow.
You can listen to Beethoven again. What happened next is very interesting and kind of unique to China. I mean, there are a couple of factors that led to what was known as Beethoven fever. So remember, you had 10 years of pent-up demand for this music. Then in China in the 1980s, you had this economic revival. So families, had more disposable income to spend on their children. And most families only had one child because there was the one-child policy. So those kind of factors together led to this resurgence of interest in classical music. And, we have seen generations now of Chinese musicians who have really had an impact all over the world. So Tan Dun is a composer who's featured in the film, and he represents kind of that first generation after the end of the Cultural Revolution. And then there's Lang Lang, who did his training in Philadelphia at the Curtis Institute. And there's a third musician that we feature in the film. His name is Peng Peng, and he's a young composer who trained at Juilliard and now is the resident composer at the Shanghai Philharmonic. And the Philadelphia Orchestra brought the Shanghai Philharmonic to town in 2019, and they performed one of Peng Peng's symphonies. So there's been just this evolution, and it's only been one generation. And the thing that we try to convey in the movie, John, is how China went from basically 0 to 100 miles per hour when it comes to interest in classical music in one generation.
You really do give that sense, because from one moment you have the orchestra visiting, the next moment everybody's making cellos and violins in factories,
Yes.
and there's these huge lines of cellos waiting to go, and you think, holy goodness, this is new. This is you really get a sense that things have changed in the culture.
Yeah, and the thing is, China is a country of 1.5 billion people. That's a lot of people. So we're not suggesting that everyone in China is a fan of classical music. No. But the middle class, the educated class, they really have embraced, the art form. And so that's a huge number in itself. There's a professor from the Shanghai Conservatory who says in our film how there are probably 200,000 kids learning the piano in Shanghai alone. And that's probably a conservative number. So that gives you an idea of the magnitude we're talking about.
There's a moment in the film, too, where the Philadelphia Orchestra has gone back to China to perform. And one of the violinists stands up and addresses the crowd and says, "Hey, guess what? I speak Chinese."
Right.
Because he's one of the people who has come to Philadelphia to study.
Yes.
One of the other things that the film points out, though, is that whereas China took off as far as children learning classical music, it's gone the other way in America. That there's a really nice part of the film where a principal at a school talks about how she reintroduced music into the curriculum, that the principal before her had cut it for budgetary reasons, and that she brought it back immediately because of her belief in music.
But also, Don, the reason that whole scene is in the film too is she was able to do that because Lang Lang, his foundation, gave them a grant, and that without that money, she wouldn't be able to reintroduce music to the students in this Philadelphia public school. It's ironic that Lang Lang, as a 10-year-old, remembers going to the Great Hall of the People and hearing the Philadelphia Orchestra perform, and it left such an impression on him. Fast forward to the present, and it was because of his generosity that many public schools are able to introduce music into the classroom. So that Philadelphia public school is one of, I think, about 50 that he's supporting. So, we make the point in the film about music education and how vital it is to the vibrancy of the whole classical music scene. And Yannick Nézet-Séguin, the wonderful artistic director of the Philadelphia Orchestra, makes the point that the place where youth is really embracing this music is in China. And, it's not only parents who are pushing it on their kids, and they are, but the government has made an investment in kind of music education as well as the hardware and software that goes into music. So there are these new conservatories across the country. There's one in Sichuan province that I think has 10,000 students at a music conservatory. There are new concert halls, and the number of professional orchestras has doubled in recent times. So there's a lot going on to kind of fuel this interest in the art form.
We'd like to go back to something we were talking about earlier, and that is the end of the Cultural Revolution and how that lifted the curtain, so to speak,
right,
to get more Chinese involved in classical music. But going back to when the Philadelphia Orchestra went there the first time, they were dealing with Mao's wife, who at the time was one of the people in charge of the Cultural Revolution. And there was a debate about which Beethoven symphony to play. She said yes for the sixth, the pastoral, but not for the fifth, because the fifth, I guess, was a little too aggressive for her or something like that, which just kind of goes to prove how shrouded in ignorance the people of China were about how classical music was performed, and because little quirks like that were keeping everybody in the dark.
Yeah, well, it also reveals how political music was back then, and less so now, but certainly back then it was about politics, not just music. And Madame Mao was the head of what became known as the Gang of Four. And, back in those times, people could only perform revolutionary music. But Madame Mao, I think, was just trying to exert her influence too. It's one of my favorite anecdotes from the 1973 tour, because Ormandy, a bit of a diva, and no one tells him what to do. So he came prepared to play Beethoven's Fifth.
As one does.
Yeah, and they did perform it, but there was this one particular concert that it was kind of the leadership concert, and that's the one that Mao's wife was going to attend, and she wasn't interested in the fifth. She wanted to hear the sixth, and the story as it's recounted in the film is Ormandy basically said, "Well, I hate the sixth. I'm not playing the sixth, and we didn't bring the music." So he was convinced, though, that the future of U.S.-China relations rested on his decision of whether or not he would capitulate and play the sixth, which he dutifully did. And, they had to borrow the scores, and the scores were a mess. And, a lot of them were handwritten. The reason is, back in the worst days of the Cultural Revolution, a lot of music scores were destroyed. So conservatories and musicians didn't have their music. So anyway, they patched together enough copies so the orchestra could perform. And my other favorite line from the film is a wonderful violinist who recently passed away, Larry Gricka. He said to me, he goes, "You're talking about the Philadelphia Orchestra. You're talking about Beethoven. We could have played this with pages missing." So they soldiered on, and they performed Beethoven Sixth, and later they performed the Fifth, I think in Shanghai once, and maybe once in Beijing. There were like a total of 6 concerts that they gave altogether, and Mao's wife attended one of them.
We'll be back to our podcast in just a moment, but first, here is a soothing musical interlude.
Jennifer Lin is a filmmaker, writer, and journalist living near Philadelphia. For 30 years, she worked as a reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer, reporting on events in China, Taiwan, Indonesia, and throughout the Asian world.
But she soon realized that the story she wanted to tell was that of her own Chinese family, which had converted to Christianity in the late 1800s and endured persecution and hardship to come to the United States. The result was Shanghai Faithful.
Her documentary, Beethoven in Beijing, tells the story of the Philadelphia Orchestra's 1973 visit to China, bringing not only Western music, but also a new relationship between China and the United States, and a China-wide obsession with Beethoven.
Jennifer also wrote the accompanying book. For more on Jennifer, check out shanghaifaithful.com. That's SHANGHAI Faithful, all one word, .com. Beethoven in Beijing is available on PBS Passport under Great Performances.
And now we return you to the musical Innertube, already in progress.
So, I'd like to talk for a minute about Shanghai Faithful, which is one of my favorite nonfiction books. Having reviewed it for the Inquirer.
Yes, thank you, John.
You bet. It was a pleasure. When you were a little girl, how did the story of your family come to you? I mean, I get this sense that, Jennifer, you went back to China sometimes. It was part of the family thing. People made sure that you knew about the family and kept your roots there. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So, John, my father grew up in Shanghai, and he left China in 1949. He was part of the great diaspora of Chinese who fled China at the end of the Civil War. And my grandfather, the Reverend Lin Buji, actually came to Philadelphia in 1918 to study. He went to Penn for 2 years, and he went to the former Episcopal Seminary in Philadelphia. And basically, my grandfather told his 4 children, listen, if you'd like to go study in the West, you got to leave now, and you got to go now. And 2 of my father and his brother decided to leave, and the other 2 stayed behind for various reasons. My dad was in medical school at St. John's University in Shanghai, and that university had a relationship with Penn Medical School and some of the doctors at Penn. So Dad was able to leave China in 49 and get a residency. It's kind of a funny twist. He was in Shanghai, the fall of Shanghai, 1949, May. And by July, he's in Atlantic City, New Jersey, at Atlantic City Memorial Hospital, working as an intern there. But growing up, my father, his plan was to come to the United States, study medicine, and go back to China. But the situation just got more perilous. So he decided to stay. Lucky for me, because he met my mother, who was an Italian nurse at Temple Hospital, and they married. But to your question, when my parents married in 1953, my grandfather, who spoke flawless English and wrote beautifully, he began writing to my mother and to our family on a monthly basis. So I grew up getting, our family would get monthly letters from Shanghai with my grandfather explaining, what was happening to the family and telling us news from the home front. My Italian mother had the good sense to save all of these letters. So, I grew up with what I thought was an understanding kind of my dad's life in China. And 1979, my father took us to China. Just a quick little history refresh here. Nixon went to China in 72. Carter renewed diplomatic relations in 78. And as soon as that happened, my dad got a visa to take us back to visit the family he left behind. His sister and his brother were still in Shanghai, and he wanted us to meet them. He wanted to see them. And we stayed in the family home. But what we learned that first day in China is how these letters really hid from us what had happened to the family, the previous 25 years, after 49, when my dad left. And he had been pretty much clueless. We all had been clueless, the degree of suffering in the family. So for me, I was a college student at the time, and it was 1979. And it was just this seminal moment where it was like, it kind of changed my life a little bit. I became really, my dad said, obsessed with kind of figuring out the family history and why things happened to them. And that required kind of learning more about their experiences and pushing me further and further into the past. And I decided to write a book about it. So that is Shanghai Faithful. It's really me trying to come to terms with my family history. What made them interesting is that they were Christians going back 5 generations. So really, I look at modern Chinese history over the last 150 years, but through the lens of this one family. And by virtue of the fact that they were Christians meant that they had ties with Westerners, which kind of made them unique for another reason.
I noticed that the book is written very much like a novel. It's almost like you've taken members of your family and made them characters in a novel, because after setting us up in the introduction with how you went back and discovered how your family was actually living despite your grandfather's letters, then we launch into your very farthest back relative who was a farmer fisherman who is then exposed to these overseas, these English and American missionaries.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes from there. So it's very well told in the sense that you can follow along your family, and it reads almost like I want to say like a novel, like something like James Michener put together, in the sense that you follow characters through their lives, and through that you get to see the whole picture of how China works and how China, doesn't work in some cases.
Well, Don, thanks for that review.
You're welcome.
I appreciate it.
You can read John's,
Read it, everybody.
or you can listen to me.
Yeah.
Yes. I think Don did much better in 1 minute than I did in 800 words. Yes.
No.
Yeah, but I wasn't paid for it, John. So there you go.
But yeah, that was intentional, Don. I'm the first to admit I'm not a scholar, but I relied on scholarship to write the book. A lot of scholarship, and I wanted to tell the family story as a story. So it's narrative nonfiction, and there are many great, great authors and practitioners of this style of writing. Here's a fun fact. My first internship was at the Bucks County Courier-Times in 1979.
Wow.
And I was on the Sunday staff, and the other reporter, there were two reporters on the Sunday staff, me and an editor, and the other reporter was Eric Larson, who is arguably like
Devil in the White City.
Oh
Yeah.
my God, he is like the most amazing writer. And when it comes to narrative nonfiction, no one does it better than Eric Larson. But he was on the staff of the Bucks County Courier-Times.
I did not know that. That guy basically reinvented narrative nonfiction for a new generation and made it stick and made it responsible.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm not sure that's on his Wikipedia page. It's in Levittown, PA. But yeah, I mean, I'm a great student of other good writers. And John, I'm not just saying this, but you are one of the premier writers at the Philadelphia Inquirer.
Thank you. Your check is in the mail. I think that narrative nonfiction has certainly taken the forefront in many ways. There's so much good stuff, and it goes hand in hand with the rise in documentary filmmaking, which is at its peak right now as of 2023. And you're a great example of this, that you do both things. I got a chance to see your upcoming short, 10 Times Better, about George Lee. Does this relate to your ongoing larger project Beyond Yellowface, which is about dancing and overcoming racial stereotypes in the dancing world? Because George is a great figure. He's just a really attractive personality, and boy, can he jump.
I know.
Unbelievable. But if you could talk about that, is that larger thing that you're doing about dancing and being Asian and in general. Yeah. And also, George is an example. Does he grow out of that larger project?
Yeah. So my daughter was a serious ballet dancer growing up. I was the quintessential dance mom, working backstage at the Nutcracker. And she brought me a book, Final Bow for Yellowface by Phil Chan, during the summer of 2020. And that was a summer of a lot of turmoil in this country and self-examination. So I really was searching for another documentary project, and I thought this was a good subject to look at Asian representation in ballet, which is a European art form. A lot of the classic ballets that we love, like the Nutcracker, they have a little problem when it comes to racial presentation. So anyway, Phil Chan and Georgina Paskogan are young Asian dancers in New York City, and they launched this Final Bow for Yellowface movement to try to convince the elite ballet world to kind of take a look at how they represent Asians in their ballets and change. So I was doing research. It was literally, John, a year ago at the New York Public Library. I was doing research on the Nutcracker. So I was looking at the New York City Ballet's photographs of their premiere of the Nutcracker in 1954, which was done by the great George Balanchine. And so, I'm looking at the pictures of the dancer doing the Chinese dance, and I was surprised, like he was Chinese, Asian. And I thought, wow, this guy is really amazing. He must have been like the first Asian dancer in the New York City Ballet. And George Lee got incredible reviews for his performance in The Nutcracker in 1954. In fact, the guy who took over the role, a dancer by the name of Richard Thomas, said no one could do what George Lee could do when it came to his athleticism and artistry. And so I tried to find what happened to George Lee, and I could not find him with any major ballet company. So now the reporter in me kicks in, and I became, obsessed with finding George Lee. And so literally this was November of last year. It took me about 6 weeks to track him down, but I found him in Las Vegas. And I called him up and I left a message. I said, I'm trying to reach George Lee, the ballet dancer. And he called me back. He said, this is George Lee. And yes, I was a ballet dancer, but why are you looking for me? And so I asked him the $64,000 question, like, George, what happened to you? Why didn't you have this long, great career in ballet? He said, oh, well, they thought I was too short. I'm only 5'5", so I didn't get hired by the New York City Ballet, but I went and worked on Broadway. He said, Gene Kelly gave me a job in Flower Drum Song, and he danced on Broadway. But when George explained to me his background, his history, how he was born in Hong Kong, raised in Shanghai during the war years, he had to perform in nightclubs as a young child dancer as a way of earning money for himself and his mom. His mother was a Polish ballerina. His father was a Chinese acrobat, and the mother was raising him alone in Shanghai. So George grew up in Shanghai, fled in 1949, spent 2 years in a jungle refugee camp in the Philippines, lands in Manhattan in 1951, gets a scholarship to the School of American Ballet, which is and was the top ballet school in America, and then gets, tapped by George Balanchine to originate the tea divertissement in the Nutcracker at the age of 18. He's a high school student. He had been in this country for 3 years. And it's just like such a phenomenal story. The reason it's called 10 Times Better is his white Polish mother told him, George, you're going to America. You're Chinese. You have to be 10 times better if you expect to succeed in America. And, that stuck in his head, and that was the driving force in his life. And I think that message will resonate with a lot of immigrants, women, anyone who has had to prove themselves in a white culture.
Yeah, and if you're worried that you were a stage mom for your daughter, that doesn't hold a candle to what George's mom was. And having Polish in-laws, I know exactly what she was like. I can picture her exactly what she was like. But there was also a part and I hope I'm not giving anything away because this comes out next year, I guess it is.
February.
But there's a part in the thing where he's playing in Flower Drum Song, and he does a magnificent jump and twirl where he twirls in the air twice, almost 3 times before he lands. And he talks about there was one performance where he was a little tired and he touched the ground when he landed, and everybody else in the chorus says, "Oh, he's human."
Yeah, I love that. Don, what's interesting about George is when he was a child in Shanghai, his mother made him take ballet class with Russian adults. Mm. So he grew up in kind of the Russian system. No one does it better than the Russians when it comes to ballet. And so his training was actually very good. So he could do these double tours, they're called, without wobbling or wavering at all. So the one time he did, he said his friends just went wild backstage. He's human.
So I'm wondering about, where does this debut next year? Is it on PBS, or is it going to be doing the tours in film conferences?
So we're doing the film festival circuit, And we're going to premiere in February at the Dance on Camera Film Festival in New York City at Lincoln Center. So that is February 9th through 12th, I think. And the New York Public Library is also going to do a special event on February the 7th through a program called Works and Process about the making of the film. And George is coming out to New York for that. So he's in Las Vegas, but he'll be joining me. And we're going to talk about the research and finding him and collaborating on this film. So that's exciting.
Really exciting. What about Beyond Yellowface itself? I know it's a huge project, and I'm wondering, could you tell us about what stage it's in?
Yeah, we're still in production, and we're continuing with filming. We've filmed for about 2 years now, and there is filming that we plan to do in March, where Phil Chan is going to be at Indiana University and restaging a classic ballet called La Bayadère, but taking it out of a Hindu temple and placing it in Hollywood during the Golden Age. So it's an experiment in kind of reimagining ballet. I mean, it's done all the time with Shakespeare, with other forms of theater. So this is attempt to do the same with ballet.
Jennifer, in looking up Shanghai Faithful, I stumbled upon another book that you co-wrote, Soul Sisters.
Yes.
That you co-wrote. Actually, it's something that you and another author have done where you were running and you ran into other female runners and you got their stories and put them together. I guess this was when you were still working at the Inquirer.
Yes.
But that's another one of those occupations where you can deep dive into being a runner and just get, obsessed with it and get, and that kind of defines your life for a little while in a good way. But tell us a little about that.
Yeah. So that was written with my dear friend, Sue Warner, who was a reporter with me at the Inquirer. Oh, wow. That's like ancient history, Don. I think it came out in 2007. But Sue and I would run every day at lunch along the River Drive in Philadelphia. And, as we're out there doing our daily therapy, we called it, because it was as much exercise as kind of emotional therapy for both of us. But we noticed that there were a lot of other women. So really that was the catalyst, just like so many more women were running at that time. Again, I'm showing my age because it was like ancient times, basically 2007. But we started gathering stories of other women and running. So it's not about just women runners. It's about women and their relationship to running. But yeah, I think it still holds up pretty well these many years later. But Sue and I don't run anymore. We just walk.
Yeah.
I know what that's about.
Yeah. And it's Soul Sisters. If anybody wants to find it, it's SOLE, like the soul of a ship.
Right. Aren't we clever?
Right. Yeah.
Well, you are very clever, Jen. And I hope that we can have you on later next year when some of these other projects get into the public eye, because there's so much more to talk about. The book we've been talking about most, we've just talked about Soul Sisters. We've also mentioned Shanghai Faithful. The movie we've been talking most about is Beethoven in Beijing. And we also mentioned 10 Times Better, which is about George Lee, and just a wonderfully charming and informative film. And Jennifer, you do so many things so well. We hope we can have you back on very soon.
Oh, I'd be happy to come back. It's been fun. Thank you very much for having me on your podcast.
And thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube.
Our lovely little podcast is available everywhere good podcasts are found. Listen on your favorite platform, and if you like what you hear, please give us a good rating.
And spread the word. Tell your friends about the Innertube and let them know they can subscribe to the podcast on our website, musicalinnertube.com.
There you can listen to all of our podcasts, see pictures and biographies of our guests, and contact us. You can even click on the microphone button in the lower right corner to leave us a voicemail.
And don't forget to leave your email address on our Talk to the Tube page so we can stay in touch.
And you can email us directly at musicalinnertube@gmail.com.
And as always, thanks to virtual band Car Radio Dog for our theme music.